Hi, everyone. So let's talk a little bit about philosophy of biology for this week. Right. So the philosophy of science we've done so far has, at least the pure philosophy of science in the sense of the Popper and the Kuhn and a lot of the Grinnell, was mostly based on what you might call the hard sciences: physics, astronomy, chemistry, that kind of thing. And historically, tons of philosophy of science, actually most of the philosophy of science done in the 20th century, was very focused on the physical sciences in the sense of physics. So physics was taken to be the kind of paradigm science by people like Popper, and to the extent that other sciences didn't look like physics, all the worse for those other sciences. But somewhere in the late-ish 20th century, so the 70s and the 80s, philosophy of biology started taking off as its own discipline. Now there's a kind of people who focus exclusively on biology and the kind of philosophy thereof. And what they found is that biology often looks very different than physics as a science. The kind of methods and knowledge produced are substantially different than the kind of particle physics that were taken to be the paradigm sciences. So we're just going to look at a few of the issues in philosophy of biology. This isn't going to be comprehensive by any means. There's just not kind of time and space to go through everything that people talk about here. But I wanted to give you at least a sample of the sort of things that philosophers of biology work on. So let's start with this idea. So last time that we met in person, we were talking about explanations, and we were talking specifically about causal explanations. So the argument went something like this. We had Hempel's deductive nomological account of explanation. It looked okay, but it turns out there's all kinds of weird consequences of it if you don't require that the explanation include the cause of the thing being explained. And then we looked a little bit at causes, and we found that there's at least two substantially different notions of cause. And one of those notions was this production account. That is, when you're trying to explain something in terms of what caused it, really what you should be talking about is whatever kind of pushed and pulled it into being the way that it is. So if you want to know how a clock works, you trace out all the gears in the clock and how each gear pushes or pulls on every other gear. And for a long time, I think I've talked about this already, but just to remind you, that was considered the only respectable type of scientific explanation. So real explanations are mechanical explanations, according to this view. So this view about explanation comes from the rejection of Aristotle. So, and not just Aristotle, but so Aristotle kicks off this huge research project that spans huge parts of the globe. So throughout Europe, throughout the Middle East, people were doing research in an Aristotelian framework. And Aristotle liked explaining things in terms of their goals or purposes. So Aristotle's picture of the world was in fact very biological. So the things he says about physics make a lot of sense when you're talking about living things. But to modern ears, they sound pretty weird when you apply them to non-living things. So, for example, this is the kind of explanation that Aristotle would give. He would say things like, fire goes up because that's where it wants to be. Not in a kind of full-blown fire has a mind sense, but that its proper place in the universe is up above the air. So it's trying in some kind of non-mental way, but still in a goal-directed way, trying to get back up to its proper place. And when a rock falls down, it's doing the same thing. So the essence or nature of a rock has built into it that its proper place, its goal, is the center of the universe. And the essence or nature of fire has built into it that its proper place is up above the atmosphere. And that's why when you let go of a rock, it always falls down. And when you light a fire, it always seems to want to go up. So these are explanations in terms of essences, and those essences tell us about the goal or purpose of various things. And this is, there's a lot of confirmation available for this theory. Like if you want to confirm the theory that rocks are trying to go down, well, drop a rock and it'll fall. So, or light a fire, it'll go up. So a highly, highly confirmed theory. And Popper will tell you why that's not good enough. But it's got the following problem with it. So people started to worry about the idea of circular reasoning. So one of the reasons you might demand that all of your explanations be in terms of causal mechanisms pushing and pulling is that it helps you get out from under the threat of circular reasoning. So here's a nice historical example of the kind of circular reasoning that people started getting worried about. So this is from Moliere wrote a play, I don't think it's a play, just like a satire about scholastic philosophy. The scholastic philosophers were boring, stuffy Aristotelians who worked in the university and churches. And in this satire, Moliere has a medical student being examined. So the student is taking a test, and the examiners asked him, "Why does opium make people sleepy?" And he replies, "Because it has a dormitive virtue." And dormitive just means makes you sleepy. So, but the examiners were thrilled with this. Yes, that's exactly right. It's got opium makes you sleepy because it has a dormitive virtue, and that was accepted by them as a really good explanation. But of course, all he's really said is it makes you sleepy because it has the property of making you sleepy, which really doesn't tell you all that much about the world, of course. So, and this is a lot like Aristotle's explanations in physics. So, why does fire go up? Because it's got in its nature going up. Because the essence of fire is to have a proper place in the universe where it's above the air. Well, really what you just said was it goes up because it is supposed to go up. Which isn't much of, I hope you agree, that's not much of an explanation. If you want to say, why does fire do this? Say, well, that's the kind of thing that fire is. It's a bit of a circular explanation, like saying opium makes people sleepy because it has a dormitive virtue. Okay, so Aristotelian philosophy was kind of riddled with these circular explanations. And if you put your foot down and say, look, the only kind of explanation that we're willing to accept are mechanical explanations, well, then you can get out from under this, right? You can get away from the kind of danger of circular explanations, because mechanical explanations are never circular like this. A mechanical explanation says, why did this thing move? Because that thing pushed it. Some other thing pushed it. You get rid of the kind of danger of circularity that comes about when you're willing to accept goal-based or purpose-based explanations. So this was the project. Now, that works very well. Mechanical explanations work very, very well in non-living systems. That's great for non-living systems. But one of the big fans of the scientific revolution, Immanuel Kant, he was a huge fan of scientific revolutions and this idea that we have to require mechanical explanations for things. But he noticed that mechanical explanations don't really work that well for living things, for the biological world. So this is from Kant's third critique, his critique of judgment. He points out, it's Kant, so it's a lot longer and more complicated than this, but the very rough picture is, he asks questions like, okay, so what explains how trees come about? So tell me how trees get to be. And part of the answer is, well, they've got these leaves, and these leaves collect sunlight. The sunlight feeds the tree. So what explains the structure and the nature and the existence of trees? Well, partly the existence of leaves. Of course, you need the trunk and the roots as well, but the leaves are certainly part of the story. Okay, great. So then what explains the structure and nature of leaves? Well, the leaves are the way that they are in order to provide nutrient to the tree. Okay, so that in order to should perk up your ears, and it certainly perked up Kant's ears because that's a goal-based explanation. So if you want to know why leaves are the way they are, you need to know that they're for the purpose of growing a tree. So we're using trees to explain leaves and leaves to explain trees. We've got a circular explanation, exactly the sort of thing that we were trying to get rid of by switching over just to mechanical explanations. So Kant thinks this is a problem. He thinks it's actually a big problem. So here's another example. So why do birds have hollow bones? Turns out birds have hollow bones. There's not really any kind of mechanical reason why they should have hollow bones. Lots of animals like us have solid bones. So if you want to explain why birds have hollow bones, it's helpful, of course, to know things like, well, the bird is trying to fly around. You know, the bird makes its living in the world by being able to fly from tree to tree, and that's how they get by. But what that's doing is citing overall facts about the whole system in order to explain and understand the parts of the system. And that's quite backward. So we're explaining the purpose of hollow bones, right? So we're trying to understand the parts of the system. And the traditional mechanical philosophy way of understanding the world is first you understand the parts, and then you use your understanding of how the parts work to understand how the overall system is organized. That's how it's supposed to work, and your understanding of the parts is only supposed to be in terms of mechanical forces acting on them. So that's a bit worrying for Kant. He's a big fan of science. He really thinks scientific understanding is the best way to understand the world, and at least the natural world. And he's convinced by the kind of consensus amongst his peers that mechanical explanation is the only respectable kind of explanation. But living things seem to call for different types of explanation than just mechanical. So in the mechanical explanation, you understand the pushing and pulling on the parts of the system, and those pushing and pulling make the parts the way they are, and then having understood the parts, you can build up to understanding the overall system. But when you ask why do birds have hollow bones, you have to go in the other direction. So to understand the parts, you need to understand the way those parts play into the goal-directed behavior of birds as a whole. That is, they want to fly. That's why their bones need to be hollow and light. And Kant cites the fact that lots and lots of other animals have solid bones to show that there's nothing necessary at the mechanical level about hollow bones. It's not necessary because we don't have hollow bones. We have solid bones. So you can't come up with something. So if the point of explanation is to rule out some contrast class, say why not this thing? Why this thing rather than the other thing? And at the level of, if you just look at the level of our parts, so our bones, say why is it the birds have hollow bones and we have solid bones? If you're just looking at the level of the parts, there's no way to rule out the contrast class here. There's no way to say, well, they had to be hollow because because we know that at least at the level of the parts, so without considering the overall organization of human lives versus bird lives, you know that there's nothing that you can use to rule out the possibility of solid bones because other animals have solid bones. So it's not only possible, it's actual in lots of living things. So just pursuing the scientific revolution, mechanical philosophy strategy for dealing with trying to understand the world, it looks like living things present a really deep problem. So here's a kind of summary version of the argument from Kant. So living things, he says, are self-organized. Now, this is a term Kant makes up. He uses it very differently than people use it now, but self-organized in the sense that the parts create the whole, and the whole creates the parts. So the tree makes it such that the leaves can emerge, and the leaves make it such that the tree can emerge. The bird makes hollow bones, but the hollow bones make it possible for the bird to fly around to get the food to make the hollow bones. So this looks like a kind of circular causation, parts causing wholes and wholes causing parts, which is deeply worrying to Kant, who's committed to the idea that science works from bottom up, right? Mechanical causes. Understand the parts and their mechanical forces. That lets you understand the whole. It's not supposed to go the other way around. And the reason why it's not supposed to go the other way around is that this kind of circular causation gets us involved in circular explanations. And these circular explanations are not allowed, just for the same reason that saying that opium has a dormitive virtue is not a good explanation. Right? You're just talking in circles. So here's what Kant concludes. There can never be a science of living things. There can never be biology. He says it like this. He says, it's absurd to hope that maybe another Newton may someday arise to make intelligible to us even the genesis of but a blade of grass. He's very confident here. Kant was always very confident, but he's very confident here. He thinks that because the way we're organized at a parts level is contingent, that is, it really could have been otherwise, and that you need our overall organization to explain that, because you always need, you might say, teleological or goal-based explanations to understand living things, and those are forbidden from science. That means you can never have a science of biology. So I'm happy to report that he turns out to be wrong. There does exist a science of biology. You can visit the buildings and you can read their journals and textbooks. Some of you are majoring in biology, so it's probably not too much of a surprise to say that, yeah, we do have a science of biology, and in some sense we do have a Newton of the blade of grass, and of course that Newton is Darwin. So Darwin's theory of evolution provides a pretty good answer to Kant's worry. And the question for philosophers is, what kind of answer was it? And Darwin doesn't really clearly tell us what kind of answer he's giving, but here are two possibilities. So this is from the reading for this week, the Rosenberg chapter on philosophy of biology. Rosenberg says, by showing how adaptations could arise through a purely causal process, Darwin either made real purposes safe for natural science or banished them as mere appearances. And there's an ongoing debate in philosophy of biology about which of those two Darwin actually did. So did he show us how purposes are respectable? So scientific revolution view said, no, we can't talk about purposes anymore. That's getting us all messed up in these circular explanations, which are no good. So maybe Darwin rehabilitates the notion of purposes. So if we look back at Kant's argument, we say, look, these kind of circular causation of parts causing wholes, but also wholes causing parts, that's gets us intellectually messed up. Maybe what Darwin did was show us that no, you can have that type of causation without getting into a circular explanation or circular reasoning or something like that. So that's one possibility. Maybe he rehabilitated purpose-based explanations. The other possibility, the other way to read Darwin, is to say, no, he actually got rid of them. So he showed us how to deal with the apparent goal-directedness of living things in a way that doesn't require real goal-directedness. We can say something like, yeah, okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is that hearts are for pumping blood. But in reality, the real story is just 50 million years ago, we all had an ancestor, and that ancestor had a pump-like thing in its body that was pretty good at moving a blood-like substance around its circulatory system. And because it had a pump-like thing that was efficient at moving stuff around it, it got to survive and reproduce. And because it got to survive and reproduce, that's why we have a heart like the way we have it. So you tell this very long and complicated and detailed story about the mechanical causes that led up to living beings being the way that they are. And that replaces the purpose-based explanation. So we'll talk a bit more of this. We'll talk more about this next week. I'd like to leave this question off here, so I'll just leave this as a big question mark for you. What should we say about purposes in biology? So does the fact that it looks like my eyes are for seeing and my ears are for hearing and my heart is for pumping blood, those all sound like what we're attributing to things are goals and purposes. And that's certainly the way that the sentences are coming out of my mouth. But given Darwin's theory of evolution, should we say one of the two following things? Should we say that there really are purposes in the world, and now we know how they came about? Now we know how purely natural forces can bring about purpose-governed systems. Or should we say, no, actually Darwin showed us why we don't actually need to talk that way. We don't need to think about purposes anymore. So that's a question we can take up when we talk about functions being sort of related to purposes next week. Okay, so let's do a few more ideas in philosophy of biology. We'll just do kind of sample of different ideas around philosophy of biology. So let's talk a little bit about laws. So recall again, when we talked about explanation, we talked about Hempel's deductive nomological account. It's deductive because you're deducing the thing you want explained, and it's nomological, nomos means law, because you're deducing it from a law of nature. So that's fine and good in physics. Well, we saw some problems with it, but it fits pretty well in the world of physics and chemistry, where there are really good laws. I mean, there are really genuinely universal laws. So, all objects create a gravitational field around them, or sort of affect the gravitational field around them. I don't think that's false of anything that, of the right kind of physical composition. But there's a big debate in philosophy of biology about whether there really are any such thing as biological laws. So are there laws of biology? And to see why this is a real debate, let's look at what Rosenberg tells us about laws of nature. So this is Rosenberg's list of the things that laws are supposed to have to be a law of nature. It's supposed to have the following properties. For one thing, it's supposed to be exceptionless. There's not supposed to be a bunch of stuff running around. There's not supposed to be just one positively charged electron that weighs 5 pounds, but it's still an electron, right? It's not supposed to be that it's got, most of the time this happens. It's supposed to be exceptionless. It's also supposed to be universal. So if you remember when we talked a little bit about laws, I gave you the example of all of the coins in Corey's pocket today are quarters. That's not properly universal because it mentions specific people, places, and things. So laws of nature are not supposed to mention specific people, places, and things. And that requirement is just to rule out exactly the kind of thing I just said. So you can't make it a law of nature that all the coins in my pockets right now are quarters, because laws are supposed to be general. They're supposed to be apply widely across the universe rather than just things that happen to be happening in my pocket right now. Another thing that laws of nature are supposed to have is contingency. That is, they're supposed to be contingent. And this is going to trip us up a few times when we try to identify biological laws. So 2 + 2 = 4, you might say, is necessary. So it's just not the case that 2 + 2 = 4 is optional. That it could have added up to something else. We could, of course, use those words differently, but given the way that we've defined 2 and 2 and plus and equals, there's just no other way that could have gone. Yeah. So when we're talking about laws of nature, the idea is we're supposed to be excluding things like that. 2 + 2 = 4, or things like the law of non-contradiction. So you can't have it be true that X and not X at the same time. Those are not laws of nature exactly. Rather, they're kind of laws. They're necessary mathematical or logical laws. So the goal is to sort of separate out those things that are true because of the way the world is, and those things that are true necessarily. So, and science is supposed to be about the way the world is. It's supposed to be about stuff that you could, for example, observe, and maybe you would know what kind of observation would falsify your law, to bring it back to Popper. So for it to be contingent means that you know at least what kind of observation would show that it's not really a law. So if you've got 50 pounds of bricks that don't seem to have any gravitational attraction, that would disconfirm the thesis that any normal matter, attracts other matter gravitationally. 2 + 2 = 4. I don't even know what observation would disconfirm that, right? So laws of nature are supposed to be contingent. And they're also supposed to be explanatory and support counterfactual. So this is just the idea that is not supposed to... This was the example of the gold sphere that's 1 kilometer across versus the uranium sphere that's 1 kilometer across. So there's just not going to be a uranium sphere 1 kilometer across. You know that. It doesn't matter what your goals are. It doesn't matter how things go historically. It's just not an option for that to happen. Whereas a gold sphere 1 kilometer across, there's good economic reasons why that's not going to happen. There's good practical reasons, but it could happen. So laws of nature are supposed to be more like the uranium sphere, where it's like, no, we just know no matter how things go, that's going to be our rule, versus the gold sphere, where it's like, probably not, but there's no law, what we say, there's no law of nature, there's no law against it built into nature. So, okay, so these are just supposed to be just general facts about how we identify laws of nature. These are supposed to be our picture of what laws of nature are. Now, let's try to look around and see if we can find anything in biology that meets all of these criteria. One obvious place to look is what we might call the law of natural selection. So the thing that Darwin invented. Well, these poor stumpy giraffes didn't make it because they were outcompeted by other giraffes. It's too bad for them. Okay, so to put the law of natural selection in a kind of short, snappy version so that we've got a thing to think about here, let's put it like this. So individuals better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. If there is variation between individuals and heritability of traits, then those traits which are fitter will become more common in the population. Okay, so let's take that. There's a lot of debate about how exactly to phrase this, but let's take that as our version of the law of natural selection. Now, it certainly seems to be true that this is the case. So if you've got variation amongst different individuals in a population, like these giraffes, some of them are taller and some of them are shorter, and there's heritability of that variation. So if it's the case that every giraffe has kids of a random height, then you don't get evolution by natural selection. But if tall giraffes tend to have tall giraffe babies and short giraffes tend to have short giraffe babies, so there's variation and there's heritability, and some traits make it easier for you to survive and reproduce. So in this somewhat sad picture, the taller giraffes are more able to get at food, which allows them to survive and have more tall giraffe babies. Okay, so that says those traits which are fitter to the environment are more likely to become common in the population. So the more fit a trait is in an environment, the more likely it is to spread through the population. Okay. Now, the problem with this is a law of nature. It sounds like a pretty good law of nature. It's probabilistic, so it tells us what's likely to happen. A meteor could always come in and smash all of the giraffes tragically, and then nobody gets to reproduce. So it's not the case that this always happens. But as a statistical law, this looks pretty good, right? Now, the reason why this is regarded as not a law of nature exactly is that it looks more like a mathematical law or a law of logic. And if you recall, this was one of Popper's worries about natural selection. He eventually got over it, but one of his worries about natural selection is that it looks like it's true by definition. It looks like it's just a conceptual truth. And you can kind of support this by looking at simulations of evolution. So if you run a computer simulation with a bunch of little, there's actually versions of this with little tiny programs with like 50 to 80 lines of code. And the little tiny programs are competing for space in memory. And the code is able to reproduce itself, and every reproduction introduces some mutation. So there's variation amongst the bits of code. And those bits of code, because there's variability and heritability and differences in fitness, that is, the differences in ability of these bits of code to continue to occupy space in memory, you see evolution amongst these bits of computer program. It's quite remarkable. So evolution can take place on a computer. Evolution can take place, in the natural world. Evolution seems to be a really kind of easy to get going process, and it's pretty clear why that's the case, because if you think hard about what fitness just is defined in this thing here as the ability to leave offspring that leave offspring, right? So animals with the ability to leave offspring who leave offspring are more likely to leave offspring. Well, yeah, right? You can even imagine the laws of physics being different. You'd still have it be true that if you've got a population of things that reproduce with variation between them and heritability of that variation, and those variations make it easier or harder for those animals to pass on their genes, you're going to get evolution. Even if the laws of physics were different, it seems like that's still going to be true. So, the law of natural selection looks like it's not contingent. It's just a fact of logic or something like that. And again, philosophers are interested in separating out facts of logic from natural laws, that is, things in the world that might have been otherwise. So most people don't want to include that as a law of biology. It's a law of logic. Okay, how about something else? Let's try another one. So if you look up laws of biology, here's one that comes up: Mendel's laws. Okay, so Mendel is one of the people who did very early work on genetics. Darwin didn't actually know why it was that parents and children resemble each other. He had a elaborate story about this that was just completely wrong. So it was well after Darwin's work that people started to figure out how inheritance works. And Mendel was one of the people who did this, and he came up with some laws that he thought governed how inheritance works. So, and he's talking about genes at this point. So, one of his laws is this: the law of independent assortment. This is supposed to be a law of genetics. So, it says this: the genes which produce separate traits are passed on independently of each other. So what that means is, so your DNA is a mashup of your two parents' DNA, and you don't get all of their DNA. What you get is half from your mother and half from your father, and it's sort of just random which gene you get from which, right? So 50% of your genes are from your mother, 50% of your genes are from your father. And the law of independent assortment says these genes will be randomly assigned. So just because you got this gene from your mother doesn't mean you'll get the same gene from or a different gene from your mother as well. They are supposed to go independently. So just shuffle the deck and throw your genes together, and so independently assigned a gene from either your mother or father for each of your genes. Okay, so that's mostly true. For most genes, you have a 50-50 chance of getting it from your mother or your father. Obviously, there's some genes that you can only get from one or the other. So, for example, if you're a woman, if you have a Y chromosome, if you have a Y chromosome, you can only have got it from a male parent, because that's where Y chromosomes come from. But for most of our genes, on most of our chromosomes, this is true. But it's not always true. So it's not it's not exceptionless in the way that we want it to be. And in fact, the way in which this is not always true was very helpful in the early study of genetics. So let me tell you a very brief story about the early attempts to map genes onto chromosomes. So this fella here is it's a big old chromosome, and inside it is a whole bunch of DNA coiled together. So what Thomas Hunt Morgan and a bunch of his collaborators tried to do, 1910 thereabout, so a little bit before, a little bit after there, they were the first ones to map where various genes are on a chromosome. So they were working on flies, little fruit flies, because fruit flies are easy to keep, easy to feed, and they reproduce very rapidly. So you can do hundreds and hundreds of generations. You don't want to do this on elephants because they're the opposite of all of that. Okay, so they got this big breeding program for flies. They are sort of selectively allowing flies to breed with each other, and these flies have a bunch of variations in their bodies, their phenotype. So some flies have a spot on one part of their head, and what you can do is trace out which of the offspring of the flies gets that spot, let's say. And then what they did was take a bunch of these variations. So you've got a spot with a fly with a spot on its head, and a fly with red eyes. And to map where the genes for that spot are and where the genes for the red eyes are, they observed how often the spot and the eyes were transmitted together. So how often is it the case that a fly gets both of those traits rather than just one or the other? And their theory was, and this turns out to be true, the more often they're transmitted together, the closer they're going to be on the chromosome. So the bits of DNA that code for those two different traits are, if they're closer together, when the DNA is sort of chopped up and mixed together in their moment of reproduction, the closer they are on the chromosome, the more likely they are to be transmitted together as a unit. So it's actually a failure of independent assortment that they were using as a kind of statistical probe. So learn about the location. They reverse engineered the location of the genes for various traits on the fly chromosome. So they can see the chromosome through a microscope. They can't yet see the DNA, but they could build a map of the thing. Say, okay, red-eyed gene is here and white spot gene is here because they are very likely to be transmitted together. That is, the failures of independent assortment gave them good data on the structure of the chromosome. Okay, that was a long anecdote. I think it's a fascinating story, but these guys, they got a Nobel Prize for this. It's the first time we learned about where genes appear on a chromosome, but they're specific. The overall point for our purposes is, the specific point is, if we're holding up Mendel's laws as laws of biology, they're not exceptionless. Yeah, they're not. And the exceptions don't just stay with that. There's a bunch of other exceptions that I won't trouble you with. But the kind of things that we usually call laws in biology all have these kinds of exceptions. Maybe they don't work exactly the same in all animals. Maybe there's some small statistical deviations. Maybe there's big deviations. So there really is the argument in philosophy of biology right now is there anything that should count as biological laws? Nature seems to be really, really good at throwing up things that are just vastly irregular, right? Nature seems to refuse to create good, regular, ordinary things that always follow the same rules. There's practically always an exception to anything you want to talk about. I'll just do one more example because I love this one. I think this is super fun. If you've never heard of scaling laws, these things are just amazing. So there's a bunch of laws of the following form. What they do is relate to kind of properties of a living thing. So the graph that you got here is their metabolic rate. So how much food do they convert into energy in an hour, kind of thing, and versus their just total mass. And this is a logarithmic scale, which means that each step is like a factor of 10. And what you can see is down here, we're at like fractions and fractions of a gram. So we're below the level of a cell. This is a mitochondria. This is like a subcellular organelle. And the graph goes all the way from subcellular organelles through the cellular level, and here we've got small animals all the way up to elephants. So the scaling law tells us how mass and metabolic rate are related across 27 orders of magnitude. So from below the level of a cell to like a blue whale, this seems to be a consistent sort of relationship between variables. So this is one of the scaling laws. There's a bunch of scaling laws that relate different features of organisms, and this is the kind of thing you can only discover once you've got like big databases about a whole bunch of species that you can kind of correlate with each other. But we've discovered that there are these incredible cross-species regularities in how various features of living things are related to each other. Quite stunning. It's quite stunning. So there you go. Maybe that's a law of biology. It's a good candidate. I think it's a good candidate. The problem here is, and it turns out not to be contingent in the right way. This actually turns out to be, the best theory going right now is that this is a fact about geometry. So, West and Brown published this paper in 2005, The Origin of Allometric Scaling Laws in Biology from Genomes to Ecosystems. And what they argue is that you can explain why you see these scaling laws based on just a couple of really simple assumptions. So the assumptions are that living things are trying to fill the space inside of our bodies with hierarchical branching networks. So you've got some really, really big veins and arteries near your heart that branch into smaller arteries and veins that branch into smaller ones that branch into smaller ones. So it's a kind of fractal branching network, which they assume have, let's say, invariant terminal units. So the smallest, so assume the following. Assume that you've got this branching hierarchical network trying to fill the space inside your organism. Assume that the endpoints all have to be the same size, because there are certain just physical limits on how small a vein or an artery could be. And furthermore, they're trying to fill the space inside of you in an optimal way. So fairly simple, basic assumptions. Hierarchical branching, size of the terminal, the ends of those branches are all the same, and you're trying to fill the space as efficiently as you can. And if you make those assumptions, it turns out you get these scaling laws for free. They just kind of tumble out of those assumptions. So if your question is, why is it that the same relationship holds from like subcellular organelles to the biggest animals on the planet? The answer is, well, it's kind of just a fact about geometry. So if you understand the geometry of space-filling hierarchical networks with uniform terminal branches, then you understand that these scaling laws are always going to be true. They're always just going to tumble out as an effect of that. And again, I won't, if you're interested, read the paper. It's fascinating about how exactly that follows. But the argument is, and the consensus is, that you can explain why these scaling laws hold across 27 orders of magnitude just by thinking about it geometrically. With some simple assumptions and some geometry, scaling laws are a natural consequence, which is a pretty cool result. I mean, it's a fascinating result. What that means is the same scaling laws, if we found life in a distant galaxy, the same scaling laws would apply, because it's all three of those assumptions are probably going to be true for any possible living thing, not just living things on Earth, right? So that means that these scaling laws are laws, but they're laws, again, of geometry rather than laws of biology as such. They're also going to be true for non-living things. If you have a non-living thing with a hierarchical branching network that's trying to fill space efficiently with uniform sized terminal units, it's going to have the same kind of scaling law apply to it. So it's not a specifically biological law. That's the conclusion. Okay. So some people have been convinced by this style of argument, and it's an argument by survey, right? So look at all the things that we call laws of biology. Do any of them live up to A, being exceptionless and universal, and B, being contingent? And a lot of people think that no, there's just nothing like a biological law. So people who believe this subscribe to what you might call the evolutionary contingency thesis. So Stephen Jay Gould put this in a nice metaphor. Actually, it's kind of an odd metaphor. He said, Stephen Jay Gould, a famous paleontologist, said, if you play the tape of life over again, that is, if you rewound the history of life on Earth, started it over, and maybe moved one rock a quarter inch to the left to make it sort of like run slightly differently. But so play the tape of life over again, and he thinks that it would end up, especially in detail, very different. Right? So it's the way things actually went isn't the way that they had to have gone. John Beatty, a philosopher of science, puts this a little more technically. He says, all distinctively biological generalizations describe evolutionarily contingent states of nature. What he's saying there is just, if we're not talking about a law of logic or geometry, so natural selection is a law of logic, scaling laws are laws of geometry. If it's anything but that kind of thing, if it's a distinctively biological law, then it's a contingent state of nature, which is to say it's something that could have been some other way. So all life on Earth as we know it runs on either RNA or DNA. Could have been some other chemical. There's other types of polymers that could do the same job as DNA. So didn't have to be DNA. So it's a very strong claim. It's a claim that you can argue via cases. So if you can come up with something that couldn't have been otherwise, but is nonetheless distinctively biological, then you've shown these guys that they're wrong. Another strategy for trying to refute this sort of thing comes from people like Simon Conway Morris. So Simon Conway Morris has written a couple of books and a bunch of articles arguing against evolutionary contingency. And the strategy he uses is to focus on evolutionary convergences. So an evolutionary convergence is when very distantly related species come up with very similar adaptations. So we've got here a picture of a shark and a dolphin. And I hope you can see that there's some important similarities between the shape of their bodies. There's some differences too. So the shark's rearmost fin is vertical and the dolphin's is horizontal. But boy, they look pretty similar, don't they? And it's not because sharks and dolphins have some distant ancestor that was basically looked like both of them. So dolphins are mammals. Dolphins evolved from the same shrew-like little rodent thing that we evolved from. So something went from a four-legged little rodent thing to dolphin-shaped. And that dolphin shape ends up being very similar to a shark shape. So they came to the same conclusion quite along very different paths. That's what's called an evolutionary convergence. And these things it's not just sharks and dolphins. There are all kinds of convergences in evolution. So separate, very, very distantly related animals who end up with very similar looking bodies or very similar functions or very similar biology in a kind of lower level way. One of the most dramatic examples is eyes. So it's estimated that eyes have evolved more than 50 times in the history of life, independently. So it's 50 different routes to eyes. Now there is substantial variation in the way our eyes are structured amongst some species. So insects have compound eyes. That is, they've got like 100 or a whole collection of tiny little eyes, each of which isn't very good, but work together as a group. So that's very, very different than our eyes, which are obviously like single eyeball things. So there is some variation in the way eyes work, but there's also tons of similarity. So if you look at, for example, the structure of our eyeballs versus an octopus's eyeball, they are very similar. They work on basically the same principles, but we know with high degree of confidence that we evolved eyes separately than octopi. So we split from octopuses a really long time ago. So the structure of our eyes shows that they came about independently, but they ended up in very similar places. So this is a really dramatic example of evolutionary convergence where, after millions of years, quite separate species come up with the same idea. So if we're trying to think about evolutionary contingency, which is the idea, if you recall, so Stephen Jay Gould says, look, if you rewind life and run it over again, it would just go in a completely different direction. You wouldn't even recognize the species, especially in the way they're kind of structured in detail. It might be some overarching similarities, cells would probably come again, and might be something tree-like or that kind of thing. But Gould thinks if you started over again from the beginning, it would end up somewhere very, very different. Whereas Simon Conway Morris thinks, and Gould's argument is mostly based on fossils from the Cambrian explosion. So early fossils at the kind of early stages of the development of animal life, there was this wild proliferation of different body plans, ways of organizing bodies that were very, very different than the ones we ended up with. And only a small number of those seem to have survived. So if some other body plan happened to have survived, maybe we'd have, arms coming out of our heads and eyeballs on our shoulders or something like that. So really different organizations were possible, Gould thinks, because he's looked at a bunch of fossils that in the early stages were very, very different. Simon Conway-Morris replies, no, actually, evolutionary convergence, which is this quite common phenomenon, shows us that in the long run, evolution is going to find the best solutions. And those best solutions are going to be the same. Even if you run this thing over and over and over again, you're going to get something that's shaped like a shark or like a dolphin. You're going to get eyeballs. You're going to get locomotion on legs or something like that. And if Conway-Morris is right, then if we ever meet aliens, they're probably going to look a lot like us, because if evolution converges on just a few designs, we're at least, maybe they don't look like us, but we'll at least recognize the basic shape and outline of species that with utterly separate evolutionary history. So if they've evolved on some distant planet, they're nonetheless going to end up basically where we ended up. So that's the evolutionary convergence, evolutionary contingency debate. Should we believe that evolution really could have gone some completely separate way, or should we believe that, in fact, it was going to end up basically here anyway? Okay, so one last thing. One last debate in philosophy of biology, and I'll leave it there. But I just want to note that I'm not by any means, I'll remind you, I'm not by any means covering all of the stuff in philosophy of biology. This is just kind of a sample of different issues. And next week we'll talk about function again, which is mentioned in the reading for this week. So we'll develop the idea of functional explanation a bit more. Okay. But here's just a kind of general interest. Well, I think it's an interesting debate within philosophy of biology, which is biology and this question of like what kind of animals are we? If you were trying to pick a science that would tell us whether there's such a thing as human nature, and if there is, what is it? Like, biology seems to be the place to be for me. I mean, if I had to pick a science, I mean, physics will tell you you're made out of quarks. That's not super helpful if what you want to know is how should I live my life. You say, I want to live my life in accordance with my nature. I want to try to be the kind of thing that I'm always meant to be. And a physicist tells you you're made of quarks, or a chemist tells you you're made of mostly carbon. That's not super helpful, right? But maybe biology can tell us what kind of things we are. And we can use that information to try to live the kind of lives that we were maybe not meant to live, but certainly that we're suited to live. That's the hope. I'm going to dump a little cold water on that hope, I think, because I don't think it's an extremely tempting line of thought. It's extremely tempting to think, sure, we're going to end up with something, we're going to look at biology and try to figure out who and what we are, and it'll tell us who and what we are. And I'm going to make a brief argument for you right now that it's not that simple. So again, a little bit of history that we touched on already. So especially around Darwin's time and prior to that, especially in Europe, people thought that studying nature showed you that the state of nature is red in tooth and claw. That is, it's just utterly vicious competition. Every living thing is just out for its own interests. They'll kill and eat you if they get a chance. Nature is just a horrible place to be. That was the conclusion from people who sort of thought about this stuff in the 1800s, and even before that. So Thomas Hobbes in the 1600s said the following. He said, nature is a state of war of all against all. It's just total nature is just total anarchy. Everybody's just trying to do whatever they can to survive and dominate, and that society, in fact, is necessary. So this is part of Hobbes's argument for why you need a powerful state to tell everybody what to do. Because if you look at what nature is, so if you understand our nature as animals, what you understand is we would eat each other if we didn't have social order imposed on us by a powerful ruler. So this is the kind of picture of human nature that comes out of early modern European thinking about the state of nature. So the argument goes something like this, like, I'm not endorsing this, but I think this is what people were thinking. Ruthless competition. So here's how you get from observations of the natural world to a prescription about how we should live. Ruthless competition is everywhere in nature, they claim, so why fight it? Basically, it's just natural. Attempts to make society kind and fair and free are misguided because they're cutting against human nature. Right? What you need is either to let people tear each other apart in some kind of libertarian world, or forcefully, violently impose authority on them. So delegate one person or group of people with the authority to violently suppress human nature, because that's the only thing we're going to respond to. So this is the kind of thinking, and it's thinking that's pretty well structured around the idea that nature is intrinsically competitive. It's intrinsically cruel and mean and nasty. So I think this is worth thinking about, but I'm not sure that the evidence that we have from biology actually bears this out. So very briefly, let's talk a little bit about our closest relatives. So if you want to know what kind of being you are, here's a strategy. Look at the people that you're related to. So maybe that'll give you some information. So if your entire family is one way, maybe that gives you some evidence about the way you are. Or at least if we're trying to understand who we are as a species, maybe looking at our close relatives will tell us something about what kind of species we are. So here's our closest relatives. These are bonobos and chimps. I believe that's a chimpanzee on the left and a bonobo on the right. Humans diverged from bonobos and chimps about 5 million years ago, which in evolutionary terms is not that long. It's a long time, but in terms of evolution, these are pretty close cousins of us. And we're about equally distant from both species. So it's not the case that we're much more like chimps or much more like bonobos, at least in terms of how genetically related we are. So if we're going to learn about, is there something like human nature that's driving our behavior, these seem like good examples to start with, at least. It's not the end of the story, but these seem like interesting case studies, yeah? So let's look at what kind of animals chimpanzees and bonobos are. Chimpanzees are jerks. They are just absolute jerks. I would not want to live in chimpanzee society, and I don't think any of you would either. Males are significantly larger and more aggressive than females, and it's a male-dominated society. You might not be off the train yet, but males will regularly beat up smaller males and females. So it's a kind of coming of age rituals. You don't really get to be an adult chimpanzee until you've roughed up an adult chimpanzee male until you've roughed up all of the females in your troop. So it's just it's a society rife with fighting, like physically dominating and injuring each other, and worse. Maybe worse than that. It's pretty common for a male chimpanzee, when they take a new mate, to kill and eat the children from previous mates. So they're killing baby chimpanzees and cannibalizing them. Yeah. So I'm glad I'm not a chimpanzee. I'll tell you that. So this is like, if you're looking at our evolutionary past and you're just looking at chimpanzees, I think it's very easy to get the impression that what we are really is patriarchal, dominance-oriented, extremely violent, and ultimately very competitive. But let's look at our other closest relative. So bonobo societies are substantially more peaceful. Their society is female run, so the females of the species kind of get together and keep the peace in some sense. And bonobos in general keep the peace with a lot of, let's politely call it, physical affection. Both hetero and homosexual touching of genitals is super common. It's a kind of way of easing social tension. So if they find, for example, a nice tree with a lot of fruit in it and a bunch of bonobos are converging on it at the same time, the worry is that they would fight over the food source. And to ease the social tension, they will like have sexual contact with each other to be like, it's like a handshake for them. Like, I mean, bonobo sex is not, and chimpanzees, it's not an elaborate thing. It's 5 or 10 seconds or something like this. So it's not like they're taking up their whole day. But they're way less violent. They're way sexier in the sense of just using sex as a way of building and maintaining and repairing social bonds. They are very they're by no means monogamous, like at all. And infanticide is much less common. So I don't want to give you a picture of bonobo society where it's utterly non-violent. There is still some violence, but it's way less common to see a bonobo kill an infant than it is to see a chimpanzee kill an infant, for example. Okay, so, and these differences, I want to say, don't seem to be genetic. So if you take a chimpanzee as an infant and raise it in a bonobo society, it'll behave like a bonobo. Genetically speaking, bonobos and chimpanzees are not that different. There's not some violence gene that's just switched way on in chimpanzees and switched off in bonobos, as far as anybody can tell. And having one move from one troop to the other. So if you take a chimp and put it in a bonobo troop, it'll behave much more like a bonobo than like a chimp. So here we've got two, I would say, quite radically different pictures of where we came from. Two radically different pictures of our closest relatives. We've got this violent patriarchal society. We've got this relatively kind, sexy matriarchal society. So if the idea is that we were going to just look at our closest relatives and say, that's what human nature is really like, I have disappointing news, because that just doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be the case that we've got a genetic heritage that just tells us we're going to be one of these species or the other. It seems much more likely when you look at the natural world that we've got the potential for either, but aren't determined one way or the other. So that's all matters of debate. That's my opinion, but some stuff to think about here. And more broadly, and this is the kind of, so here's a thing about which there's much more consensus. So here we're on sort of better trod territory scientifically. The picture of nature as intrinsically competitive is just wrong. There's loads of evidence now that nature is full of cooperation, and we've got some very good mathematical models based on the kind of combination of population genetics and game theory, if you want the background, that show how cooperation can emerge in living systems. So here's one from within a species, just as an example. I think I said earlier, I said it, the normal way of saying this stuff is what evolution cares about is whether you pass on your genes. But that's not right. And you can tell it's not right by thinking about ant colonies. So ant colonies have tons and tons of workers for every queen. So a queen is the reproducing female. Typically there's only one. There's some species in which there can be more than one queen in a colony, but the typical scenario is just one or a very small number of queens and a small number of males that are allowed to mate with the queen. And the vast majority of an ant colony is workers who never mate. They never reproduce themselves. So how is it, and people were kind of baffled by this for a while, how is it that evolution is acting on these worker ants? So these worker ants have they're well fitted to their tasks. They have all these kind of adaptations, right? They can move around. They've got very functional bodies for the kind of tasks that they're involved in. So they have all the hallmarks of being shaped by natural selection, but they never reproduce. So what's going on there? The answer comes in the development of the theory of what's called kin selection. So it turns out, I mean, if you think about it, evolution is not actually going to care whether you personally pass on your genes. Evolution doesn't care about anything, but in terms of natural selection, it's the same whether you pass on your genes personally or whether you're somebody you're closely related to who has a bunch of the same genes as you passes on their genes. So for the workers who are biologically not going to reproduce, it's not on the cards for them, they share genes with the queen. So they get half of their genes from the queen and half from the male who mated with the queen. And if they scurry around their whole life working to support the colony, that makes it more likely that the queen will pass on her genes. And that means that the worker who has 50% of those genes is working to get their genes into the next generation, but not by directly reproducing themselves. So they're this enormous, complex, cooperative activity with the goal of getting their genes into the next generation, but not by themselves reproducing. So kin selection is this sort of framework in which it's pretty easy to see in a number of within species scenarios how cooperation might emerge. So this is the part of the story, for example, about why homosexuality seems to be all over the animal world. Like, homosexuality is extremely common across species. It's practically everywhere. And not just bisexuality, but lots and lots of animals seem to be exclusively interested in members of their own sex. And you'd think that that would be a big biological disadvantage. So why doesn't natural selection, so you're exclusively interested in members of your own sex, shouldn't that mean that you're losing the natural selection game, that you're not going to get your genes into the next generation? So kin selection gives us a really principled answer, apart from the complexities of human society where people who with homosexual attraction are not that much less likely to get to reproduce. But even imagining that they were, you've got an otter who's utterly uninterested in having sex with members of the opposite sex. Even in that scenario, being in a social group and not reproducing means you're available to support close kin. So this is the gay uncle, gay aunt thesis. So not aunt is the, your mother's, anyway. So so imagine in an early human society, you've got a few people in the tribe who aren't themselves reproducing, but they're around to help their brothers and sisters. So they're contributing to getting their own genes into the next generation because their nieces and nephews have about 1/4 of their genes. So if you help 4 of your nieces and nephews survive, that's a lot like having 2 of your own kids. From the perspective of evolution, through the lens of kin selection, those are the same outcome for you. So it's just not the case that you need to personally reproduce and therefore personally compete for resources. You can improve your fitness value in the sense of just getting your genes into the next generation by helping and cooperating with other members of your species. Okay, so this is a pretty deep well of explanations for how we see cooperation emerge within species. There's also huge amounts of cooperation between species, which is, you can't explain this using kin selection, but you can explain this with various game theoretic structures. So anything where it's a non-zero sum game, so where both members can benefit, you can explain the emergence of cooperation. Here's my favorite example. It's somewhat recently being worked out that trees cooperate by sharing nutrients and chemical signals. And one of the ways that they do this, they can do this by directly interlocking roots, but they can also do this by these broad mycelial networks. So mushrooms, right? Mushrooms are the fruiting bodies. They're the kind of reproductive organs of a fungi, and a fungi is that it's also got a mycelial network, which is just like a bunch of little tendrils that go through something that it can eat. So underground in forests, it's very common for there to be a vast mycelial network connecting up the roots of various trees. And the mycelial network can take nutrients from the tree, but it can also give nutrients to a different tree. So if one tree is suffering and another has got enough, the mycelial network can transport, at a small cost, of course, it needs to eat itself, from one tree to another. And these trees don't seem to be putting up biological defenses against this. They seem to be actively participating in this kind of network of sharing. Now, the exact story about why they do this is complicated and still developing, but it's probably the case that trees depend on each other in various ways. You don't want to be the only tree on a hill. You want to be surrounded by other trees, because the health of the ecosystem determines your likelihood of survival and reproduction. So by sharing resources across these mycelial networks, the mycelium, the fungi that's doing the transportation benefits, and the trees benefit. So these kind of symbiotic relationships appear all over in nature. So symbiosis emerges anytime that two species can interact in a way that benefits them both, and it seems to be super common in nature. So thinking about, I mean, again, I wish there was a textbook where I could just look up what kind of being I am and therefore what kind of life I could live. I really do wish there was such a thing. But looking at the state of biology right now, it's hard to do that. There doesn't seem to be, I would argue, there doesn't seem to be some very straightforward story we can tell ourselves about what kind of animals we are. We both compete and cooperate. We have the potential to be very violent and nasty, and the potential to be very loving and kind. So the hope, I think, the reasonable hope that biology would tell us who and what we are doesn't seem to be panning out. What biology can tell us is the potentials that we have. So we have the potential to be kind, we have the potential to be cooperative, and we have the potential to be quite brutal, and the potential to be very competitive. So we've got all of that in us, I think is what you can conclude confidently from looking at the biology. We've got all of that in us. And then maybe it's up to us to decide which parts we take up. Okay, so that's about it for our little survey of philosophy of biology. I wish I had tons of time to talk to you about this. I think there's so much interesting stuff in here. Rich source of ideas for final essays if you want to dig into some of the philosophy of biology stuff. But that's it for this time. Next week, let's go back to the idea of explanation and start talking a little bit about functional explanations. Okay. Thanks, everyone.